Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this new video in which we continue reviewing T.M. Scanlon's book, What We Owe to Each Other. This time we're going to go through the second part of the book, which is about questions of right and wrong. So now we're going to deal strictly with questions about morality. And so this part has 5 chapters. There is the chapter about wrongness and reasons, which is going to be covered by this video. Then there is the chapter of the structure of contractualism, in which Scanlon is going to present his theory of contractualism, which is the basis of his moral theory. Then there is a chapter on responsibility, one on promises, and then a last chapter on relativism. In this chapter, Scanlon argues that a moral theory, in order to be satisfying, needs to account for the motivational forces of judgments about right and wrong. Like, what is it about judgments about right and wrong that would motivate me to act ethically? So Scanlon refers to this as the problem of explaining moral motivation, in the sense that there are people for whom moral motivation cannot be explained away, and so Scanlon is going to be denying this. For Scanlon, moral motivation can be explained, and it's only a problem, like we cannot explain moral motivation only because we are framing the problem in a misleading way. And there are 2 reasons for why we are being misled. The first one, according to Scanlon, is that it suggests that the problem in question is one of understanding how people are motivated rather than of understanding the reasons that they have. And we've already talked about this in chapter 1 about reasons, that there is no separating reasons from motivation. Like, it's our reasons that motivate us to act in a certain way. So we don't really need to understand how people are being motivated by moral judgments. All we need to do is to know their reasons for being motivated by those judgments. So trying to understand motivation amounts to understanding what reasons people have for acting or not acting in certain ways. And so this leads to the second reason why the problem of explaining moral motivation can be misleading, and that is, second, the term moral motivation suggests a problem about motivation or reasons for action, a problem of understanding a special form of motivation or a special kind of reason that is triggered when one decides that it would be wrong not to do something, and can move one, even in the face of strong countervailing considerations, to do it. So a theory of moral motivation tries to explain what kind of force is there between the moment one thinks of, something is wrong, and the moment that one doesn't do that thing, or maybe does that thing. People can sometimes recognize that something is wrong, but still people don't abstain from doing it. So the common view holds that when something is wrong, that should in itself be reason enough not to do it. If someone fails to be motivated by that alone, by the fact that an action is just wrong, then there is a problem. And so this is what Scanlon calls a self-understanding account. Like, by the fact that something is wrong, one should be motivated not to do that thing. So recognizing something is wrong needs to also bring about the force to move us, or to act, the force to move us to act or not to act out on it accordingly. And that force is presupposed in the fact that, the action is wrong. Just by the fact that the action is wrong, that should be enough to provide the force of motivation. But this is a narrow understanding of the issue. Scanlon says that when we are looking for the reasons one acts in certain ways, we're not looking for the reasons that one cares about something, but why must they care about it? Like, why must I care that an action is wrong? Like, the fact that it is wrong doesn't seem to be enough. Like, I also have to answer for why should I even care that the action is wrong for me not to do it. And so the question is, what's there in the idea of wrongness that would compel me to care enough to act accordingly? So in other words, this is the question that we mentioned last time when we talked about well-being. It's the question of why be moral? You know, why should we care about right and wrong in the first place? If we ask the question this way, then the issue isn't about self-understanding or self-interpretation, but it becomes about justification. It is, in Scanlon's words, an account of why we and others have compelling reasons to be moral. So, in other words, what reasons can there be for acting morally, right? But here too we have to be careful, because justification can also be misleading for two reasons. First, it can suggest that if we don't find or have any justification, then we can be dispensed of acting morally. Like if I don't find any justification for why it is wrong to have slaves, then I guess I can have slaves. And the second reason why this is, problematic is that looking for justification suggests that when one talks to someone who is amoral, meaning someone who doesn't care about right and wrong, then we suggest that we are going to look for an argument that starts with a premise that this, amoral person agrees on. So it has to be a non-moral premise, or a premise that this amoral person is committed to, and we have to show him that he has to accept the authority of morality when we get to the conclusion. And so, although this can be plausible, like to start from a premise that is amoral, and somehow you can convince an amoral person that that they have to take into account morality, they have to be moved by morality. Although this can be plausible, Scanlon doubts that we can always provide such justifications. And so instead he writes, what we can provide, and what seems to me sufficient to answer our reasonable concerns, is a fuller explanation of the reasons for action that moral conclusions supply. So such an explanation would still have to answer the question, why be moral, but in two ways. Like the problem of the must in moral accounts can be explained in two forms. First, we have the problem of priority of right and wrong over other values. And so this means that for Scanlon, recognizing that something is wrong should be sufficient to be a reason not to act out on it, because then we would see that values about right and wrong have a priority over non-moral values. If we say that it's not the case, then we'd suppose that there are other values that are prior to moral values. If such values exist, well, we're definitely going to need an explanation for those. And so what kind of value could there be to topple moral values? It's going to be very hard to find, values that, can have priority over moral ones. And so in Scanlon's words, how can it make sense if we recognize values other than right and wrong and take them seriously to claim that reasons for this one kind have priority over all the rest? And the second form is about our attitude towards those who fail to see the reason-giving force of moral judgments. The common view is to regard those who fail to be moved by such reasons as, people who are committing a serious fault, a fault that strikes us as more serious than failing to respond to non-moral values. Like, for example, if I'm not being moved by the beauty of a painting, that is less important than not being moved by, the moral value of not killing or not stealing, right? And so Scanlon calls this the problem of the special difference of importance between consideration. Like considerations that are about morality should be given more importance than considerations that are not about morality. So we have these two problems that a moral theory of motivation must address in order to explain the must in moral requirements. Like, why must we care about moral judgments? Well, it's because of these two things, because moral values have priority over other values, and because considerations about morality have more importance than considerations that are not about morality. Quote, "The problem of priority is a problem of explaining how considerations of right and wrong can play a certain role in the thinking of an agent, and the problem of importance concerns the significance for a third party of the fact that an agent does or does not give moral considerations this role." So these are the two main requirements for a moral theory of motivation to explain why consideration of right or wrong have the priority in our thinking, and what's the importance an agent gives to such considerations. But to explain moral motivation means that we have to explain how the fact that something is wrong provides a reason not to do it. If we say that the fact that something is wrong is a reason in itself, we then are taking the reason-giving force for granted. But if we say that it is non-moral reasons that motivate us, like if I act immorally, then I'll take the risk of being punished or ostracized from the community, then we act morally out of self-interest. So in short, we have only two options here. Either the motivation is in the fact of X is wrong, or the motivation lies between the fact that X is wrong and the action, and if it lies there, then it means that it lies in non-moral reasons. But we are looking for moral reasons here, not ones driven by self-interests, like non-moral reasons are often driven by self-interest. So we either take the reason-giving force for granted, or we take it that people are moral out of self-interest. And this is a dilemma that Scanlon refers to when we look for reasons to be moral. He calls it the Pritchard dilemma. It is named after Harold Arthur Pritchard, a philosopher of the late 19th and 20th century who formulated similar dilemmas in his work. Pritchard was an intuitionist, meaning that for him morality is based on intuition. Like, I have the intuition that killing is wrong, and that is enough for him. The dilemma was more a way of showing the kind of paralysis that we'd face in morality if we look for reasons to explain morality. You know, that was Pritchard's position. But for Scanlon, he takes on the dilemma in another way. I mean, he rejects Pritchard's intuitionism. For Scanlon, we have to provide reasons for morality, and those reasons must transcend this dilemma. As Scanlon writes, so a satisfactory answer to our question must not, on the one hand, merely say that the fact that an action is wrong is a reason not to do it, but it must, on the other hand, provide an account of the reason not to do it that we can see to be intimately connected with what it is to be wrong. So how can we do this? Well, we can look at it in two ways. First, the way is to locate those satisfying answers within the range of evident moral content. Like, you look for the perfect answer on a scale that ranges from answers that are clearly about moral consideration to answers that have little connection with moral considerations. Like, the answer must be somewhere in the middle, since the former, risks turning the answers into trivialities, and the latter requires implausible explanations. But there is a second way to look for that answer within another dimension, one that ranges not based on moral content, but on whether the account of motivation is formal or substantive. So the scale would be not from little connection to moral notion to full connection to moral notions, but from formal to substantive accounts of moral motivation. So what is a formal and a substantive account of moral motivation? A formal account means that the answer we look for must be as further removed as possible from any appeal to any particular end. It must be an account of the universality of wrongness. Why is something wrong? Well, because universal reason says that it is wrong. Likewise, why be moral? Well, because universal reason says that you must be moral. So no matter what are your personal interests or particular ends, when reason, with a capital R, says that you must be moral, then you must. And so here Scanlon mentions Immanuel Kant and Jürgen Habermas as example of philosophers of formal accounts. Kant being the reference in the field with his famous categorical imperative, and Habermas is known for his communication theory that argues that when people engage in communication, they both have to enter with presupposed common rules about how communication must go, and out of those rules, well, we can derive moral principles. So that's for a formal account. A substantive account means that the answer we look for lies in the particular form or specific value that individuals are responding to in acting morally or violate in acting wrong. Like here, morality is more focused on the context, on particular ends, rather than on universal notions of morality that would apply everywhere and at all times. Here Scanlon mentions MacIntyre, a philosopher which we already encountered in past chapters. MacIntyre gives the example of the Middle Ages Christianity as opposed to the Enlightenment's project of morality. Like the Enlightenment was formal, it was a formal account of morality. It wanted to overthrow God's authority on morality, like people won't appeal to God anymore to explain why something is wrong, like they have to figure that out within morality itself. And that also came with the rejection of any human projection on morality. Like Middle Ages Christians had two things in mind when it comes to morality: to say what will lead to the attainment of man's true end and what is required by God's law. So the first means that human beings project their humanity on morality. Like human beings see themselves as being born with a certain purpose that depends on the fact that they are humans. Like I'm born as a human, so I have to act as a human, you know, I have a purpose as a human being. So I have to fulfill what is necessary for a human to have a good life. I must fulfill my purpose, my telos, as a human being. And so here then, it means that morality depends on the purpose of being human. Whatever is good for a human being to do is then considered moral for the human being. So here morality is not universal, in the sense that the Enlightenment envisioned it, like it is objective or universal, in the sense that at the level of those with whom it is concerned, right? Like it is objectively and universally moral for a human being to do what is good for a human being, but that is still, you know, pretty much a substantive account. The second part means that you have to do what God says, because basically God knows you better than you know yourself, being your creator, and so he knows what is morally good for a human being to do. Like if you don't know what's moral for humans, and Christianity of that time takes it as granted that you never know what is moral on your own, well, God is here for that. God is like the guide for that. He provides you with the manual on how to be a good human being. So this is a substantive account because it appeals to a specific good, whereas a formal account doesn't appeal to specific goods. Like one says that the way we have to be moral depends on our circumstances. That's a substantive account. And the other account says that we have to be moral. We have to be moral no matter what, and that doesn't depend on anything but reason with a capital R. So what is good about formal accounts is that it seems to be impartial and perhaps more reliable when it comes to sorting out disputes on moral grounds between people, because it appeals to reason and rationality as a guide to moral deliberation. But it has this huge weak spot, which is like it cannot explain except through either a defect in reason or because of, you know, evil or hubris or ego, why some people would fail to be moved by moral principles. Like it puts so much faith in reason that failing to be moral becomes some sort of anomaly that no rational person would do. So you can find a lot of accusation and charges of irrationality in formal accounts. And since Scanlon has a narrower view of irrationality, and we discussed this in our reviews of the first chapter, the formal account doesn't really appeal to him. Scanlon is more sensitive to the substantive account, but still substantive accounts have a problem. He says, looking for a substantive account seems to me a more promising strategy. The main difficulty for such accounts, however, is that it is not clear that they can give sufficient strong answers to the questions of importance and priority. So yeah, so those two questions, importance and priority of values, can be answered in the formal account. Why some values have importance and priority over other values? Because that value is aligned with universal reason, let's say. So it should have that importance and priority. But because substantive accounts often have a certain degree of relativism and arbitrariness within them, they can struggle with providing reasons for the importance of priority and importance of their values. Like God's authority and human telos may have importance and priority over other values for the Middle Ages Christians, but that's the problem. It has importance and priority only for those people specifically, only for those people alone. And so the question why those values must have such an importance and priority doesn't find a good answer. It is only a good answer for those who already believe that those values are important and have priority. Consider utilitarianism, for example. The idea that it's pleasure that it's at the base of morality is a substantive claim. Like, what is moral depends on the circumstances of how much pleasure it created, and therefore it seems to be grounded in something real, something concrete, human welfare. And we can say that welfare is a thick concept. A thick concept in morality. This is explained by Bernard Williams, who is mentioned in a footnote. He distinguishes between a thick and a thin concept. A thick concept is something that has some empirical relation to the world, like pleasure and welfare have that relation. We can experience them and feel them more concretely than, for example, obligation or wrongness, which are, thin concepts, and they are pretty abstract. Because of their thick nature, however, pleasure and welfare seem to be more motivational, whereas the thin concepts, like obligation or wrongness, seem motivationally empty. But as we've seen, just because something is giving you pleasure, or even pleasure to the majority of people, that doesn't mean that it is right. At best, it just comes off as arbitrary. That a concept is thick doesn't say that we have to follow it or rely on it in moral judgments. As Scanlon says, many acts are wrong even though they have little or no effect on people's happiness, and the fact that an action would promote aggregate happiness does not guarantee that it is right. Moreover, even where happiness, or at least individual well-being, is clearly at stake, its appeal alone does not seem to account for the motivation we feel to do what is right and to avoid what is wrong. So, the reason-giving force lies elsewhere. Scanlon discusses here another famous philosopher, Peter Singer, and Peter Singer is famous for many works, but in particular there is a paper that he wrote about famine in the 1970s. The paper is called Famine, Affluence and Morality, in which he argues that ordinary people are evil. They are evil because they don't donate to charity. And so Singer makes a very compelling argument there, like there's nothing wrong with the argument, and the argument is utilitarian. It is based on how much pleasure you can produce on or how much pleasure you think you can sacrifice for a bigger amount. Like, if you are okay with sacrificing your new shoes to save a child from drowning, then you accept that the little amount of pleasure you get from wearing your new shoes is nothing compared to the pleasure that the kid can experience by staying alive. And so if you accept that, then you cannot refuse to donate to charity because, well, that's basically the same thing. You give away $1 to save a child's life. But Scanlon says that what is really appealing about the argument is not how much pleasure I'd produce by donating to charity or how much people are suffering, but in Scanlon's own words, what I was moved by was not just the sense of how bad it was that people were starving in Bangladesh. What I felt overwhelmingly was the quite different sense that it was wrong for me not to aid them given how easily I could do so. So here, Scanlon basically refers to his own conscience. It feels wrong not to help when you can easily do so. It has, nothing to do with expediency. Expediency means utility here. Producing more pleasure is expedient, but moral motivation isn't a matter of utility. It's not a matter of expediency. You can think of John Stuart Mill, another famous utilitarianist philosopher, and he already pointed this out, that even from a utilitarian perspective, you can't just count on expediency to be sufficient in moral theories. For Mill, there is expedient and inexpedient actions of right and wrong, even though he is utilitarian, even though he determines the goodness of an action based on how much pleasure it produced. So Mill argues that what is moral is what contributes to the greatest happiness for the greatest number, but because some actions are not going to be punished by laws, for example, then it means that moral failing isn't just about the utility of having failed to contribute to the greatest happiness, but because you take it as opposed to your own consciousness for failing to do so. Like, contributing is morally right. It's not just expedient. As he says, so this is Scanlon quoting Mill, we do not call anything wrong unless we mean to imply that a person ought to be punished in some way for doing it. If not by law, then by the opinion of his fellow creatures. If not by opinion, then by the reproaches of his own conscience. So, contributing to the greatest happiness is something that moves us because we feel that it is the right thing to do, and not because it is useful. Because if failing at something useful will mean guilt, then you had to view that failing as something that is morally wrong, not simply wrong like you did something wrong in a mathematical operation, for example. So the challenge is to account for that feeling of it feels wrong. Like what reasons are there for an action to feel wrong? Because it's that feeling of wrongness that actually motivates us, okay? But Scanlon says that those feelings are linked to reasons, and so we must figure them out and assess them out. For a utilitarian, the greatest happiness is important for them, and hence they have a certain attitude and feeling towards that idea. So that an idea is wrong and the reasons we have not to do it must be related. So we have to formulate the nature of this relationship between the wrongness and the reasons we have about doing a certain action. And so as Scanlon been arguing all along, what we have reasons to do must be so that no one can object or reject our reasons to do the action. In other words, what we need to do then is to explain more clearly how the idea that an act is wrong flows from the idea that there is an objection of a certain kind to people's being allowed to perform such actions. And we need to do this in a way that makes clear how an act's being wrong, in the sense described, can provide a reason not to do it. So basically, Scanlon says that the wrongness of an action is determined by what reasons we can have to object to that action. If we can object to the reasons for doing something, then Scanlon argues we are on the right track for explaining moral motivation. Like, for example, why don't I steal? What's motivating me for not stealing? Well, I just cannot provide reasons in favor of stealing that cannot be rejected by others. And so this is a contractualist account of moral motivation, and Scanlon argues that such an account can answer our question about, importance and priority. It can account for both of them. And he writes about contractualism. It holds that an action is wrong if its performance under the circumstances would be disallowed by any set of principles for the general regulation of behavior that no one could reasonably reject as a basis for informed, unforced general agreement. And Scanlon insists in a note there that it is that formulation no one could reasonably reject to that is more fitting for a contractualist account rather than formulations like that everyone could reasonably accept. Because the former seems more involved into having to convince others, right? Like it holds that you need to think about what possible objections other might think of, and so you must formulate your agreements not on the grounds that they must be accepted, but rather that they cannot be objected to. So Scanlon contends that this definition of wrongness does overlap with Mill's, but it has significant differences. When we don't want something to be performed because it is wrong, then any reason in its favor would be rejected. For a utilitarian like Mill, the reason why those reasons can't be accepted is because those acts would jeopardize the greatest happiness of the greatest number. And jeopardizing the greatest happiness of the greatest number is a principle that no one can accept. Furthermore, Mill contends that when one violates such principle, punishment is needed for the pain inflicted on the wrongdoer, which will bring one balance back to the situation, and second, the amount of pain that the wrongdoer goes through in punishment produces more happiness for society at large. But Scanlon holds that not everything is rejected because it jeopardizes the greatest happiness. So Mill is wrong into thinking that as long as we have the happiness of the greatest number, we cannot reject reasons for not doing or doing certain things. And so it doesn't follow that in every case in which someone violates the principle, the happiness produced by the punishment would mean that we corrected the wrong or restored balance. Like the idea of punishment is an idea about the law, not about right and wrong. And so contractualism can account for both. But those two ideas differ a lot. One of the differences lies in motivation, like what motivates us for doing or not doing X is not whether or not the law sanctions it, but whether the law is based on principles that we cannot reasonably reject. And so those principles are about what is right and what is wrong. So we can see this easily when someone says that they are not breaking the law simply out of fear of being punished or simply out of obligation. Such person can seem to be odd because they seem to be failing at seeing the purpose of those laws or the moral principle behind those laws. They are not moved by the reasons for right and wrong that are supposed to be, backing up those laws. So if the laws are producing the greatest happiness for the greatest number, it doesn't mean that it is right if people are failing to see the reason behind such principle, and so they're not accepting those laws. So of course, laws can be immoral too, such as laws that protect slavery, for example. But if you are someone who follows those laws because you are afraid of being punished, and so you don't actually care about the fate of other people reduced to slavery, like you neither think that they are if you don't think that those laws are impossible to reject or that they are obviously rejectable, then you are clearly not doing what is right. Likewise, you need more than just the law to enforce a principle. You need to make sure that people are aware of the reasons and whether those reasons are rejectable or not. And so this is what we owe to each other. The reasons and principles about right and wrong that can't be rejected on reasonable grounds. And so this principle of what we owe to each other is prior to the principle of the greatest happiness of the greatest number. And so proponents of utilitarianism must first formulate their happiness principle on grounds that others cannot reasonably reject. And Mill is kind of aware of this in his book Utilitarianism in chapter 3 on ultimate sanction. He doesn't refer to the happiness principle but to another one, more aligned with what we owe to each other. It is called the principle of unity, which is, quote, the social feelings of mankind, the desire to be in unity with our fellow creatures. And it is because we want to be in unity with our fellow human beings that Mill considers the substantive value of happiness of the greatest number important and has priority over other values. It's necessary in order for people to live in harmony with one another. But Scanlon argues that this account is different from Mill's, because Mill simply relies on a desire to motivate us to explain our reasons for right and wrong to others. When we have the desire to be united with others, so we have reasons to provide reasons for right and wrong. And the problem is that we already dealt with these notions of desires and how they cannot really account for reasons. But Mill's idea of desire also has another problem. Mill seems to base our motivation for doing the right thing on a psychological sentiment that is just innate within human beings and is independent of any from any social conditioning. It's kind of like a special psychological element that has no explanation. It's just there. It falls from the sky. We just have this inexplicable desire, you know. And Scanlon's account, however, doesn't rely on any special psychological element of the sort. He writes, by contrast, on the account that I am offering, there is no need to appeal to a special psychological element to explain how a person could be moved to avoid an action by the thought that any principle allowing it would be one that others could reasonably reject. This is adequately explained by the fact that people have reason to want to act in ways that could be justified to others, together with the fact that when a rational person recognizes something as a reason, we do not need a further explanation of how he or she could be moved to act out on it. So, in Mill's account, you need to rely on some sort of special, perhaps non-natural power of psychology to explain motivation. But Scanlon says no to that. You only need reasons. If the person has reasons to act or not, then you have motivation. Because your reasons, as we said when mentioned a footnote, are framed as, you know, cannot be rejected by others rather than can be accepted by others. And that makes questions about right or wrong more demanding than any other question. By saying that my reasons only have to stick to can be accepted, then you can manipulate others. You can try to present your reasons in ways that others may accept them, but that can obscure why those reasons are right in the first place, right? But when you say that I have to present them so that no one can reasonably reject to them, you're thinking also from the perspective of others, making it more demanding than in the other example of, you know, just having to accept reasons rather than try to object to them. If you are willing to do that, if you are willing to be moral, seeing how demanding it is, then de facto, by default, you are motivated, because by being willing to be moral, you're already convinced. You are already convinced of some reasons that cannot be rejected, and so you are motivated. And so this is a difference between the reasons we have to want to be able to justify ourselves to others on grounds that they cannot reject, and reasons we often have for wanting to justify ourselves on grounds that they can accept. The desire for harmony doesn't tell us if it is a reason we have to want, like it's a necessary one if we want to justify ourselves to others. It can account for the other type more often, like the kind of, like, everyone can accept this, and everyone can accept, you know, the desire for harmony, because it's something that I take for granted, and that can open up a gateway for manipulation. Like, anyone who fails to be motivated by utilitarianism must be someone who lacks the desire for harmony or unity. And so we can throw him out because, after all, it's his choice, you know? Or if we keep him around, we're going to be very paternalistic towards this person, you know, if someone lacks this desire. So even if an argument seems appealing, it cannot count as a motivational basis for morality. And so Peter Singer's argument about famine is indeed compelling and appealing, but it lacks the motivational basis for morality. To quote from Scanlon, but the appeal of actual agreement cannot be the motivational basis of morality, since there are obviously cases in which acting morally requires one to resist the prevailing consensus about what is and is not justified. So an example he gives is when people are victim of an action, but they are content, they're content with it because they are convinced that their interests are less important than others. They can be happy with what is less than their actual due. A tyrant can oppress its population, but because its population is convinced that that's how things must be for the better, they can accept that and be happy and say that they are virtuous because they are humble, right? By accepting the tyranny, they see themselves as humble. But as Scanlon says, that may be true. It may be true that they are happy, but it doesn't mean that what the tyrant is doing is right. And so this is a case in which what you do, your reasons for doing it, can be accepted, but if the tyrant's reasons, on the other hand, like he asks, can my reasons be objected to instead of accepted, things would probably go differently. So agreement on its own is not sufficient reason in the case of morality. That the population agrees to its domination may be acceptable, but it is certainly rejectable. Like, people can accept it, like they can agree to it, but they cannot not reject it. Like I agree because I don't want to be killed by the tyrant, but I cannot agree on the tyrant's principle that they are moral. If I do, then I'm clearly making a mistake in my reasoning, okay? So this is the contractualist account of moral motivation. Now, should we accept it? Like, can we think of objections to it? Well, Scanlon is going to provide his reasons for why he thinks that we should accept it. He is going to provide the reasons that we cannot, that he hopes that we cannot reject, and so we'll have no choice but to accept it unless we think of a way to reject his reasons. And so his first reason is that it can explain three facts about morality better than any other theory of motivation so far. The first fact is that contractualism seems to be phenomenologically accurate. When you think about it, you can't really come up with a better way to approach right or wrong than through how others can object to it. And the second fact is that it solves the Pritchard dilemma because it describes an ideal relation with others in which the content of morality is relevant and has strong appeal when it is viewed apart from moral requirements. If you remember, the dilemma says that you either take the motivational force for granted or it must be self-interest. But by placing the moral motivation in reasons, you don't take it for granted because you need to have a complex judgment that involves others about whether or not something is wrong. And second, reasons are not about your self-interest, since they demand that you ask whether or not your self-interest can even be considered a good reason for an action. So moral requirements too need to be examined and questioned. And thirdly, the third fact is that when we want to justify ourselves to others, on reasonable grounds, of course. It plays a big role in our practical reasoning that shows how complex motivation can be, and contractualism can account for those complexities. So these are the three facts that contractualism provides. It can explain. It is phenomenologically accurate. It solves the dilemma, and 3, it accounts for the complexity of motivation. So the common view on motivation basically holds that motivation is about an action and punishment. Scanlon's view is what motivates me to either do or not an action doesn't just come in the form of laws, but also social rules that are not sanctioned by the state. This is a narrow view of motivation that cannot be explained by the complex process of practical reasoning. Most of the time, Scanlon says that when we do things for others, we're not thinking whether or not doing it would be wrong in the sense of whether or not I'll be sanctioned or punished. Like, our practical reasoning usually stops at things like, she's counting on me, he needs my help, doing that would put them in danger, etc. So not everything has to follow the sanctioned model. And as a matter of fact, it is very rare when the sanctioned model is needed to account for motivation. As Scanlon writes, the contractualist account can explain these facts about moral motivation because the source of motivation that it identifies, the ideal of justifiability to others, does not figure merely as a sanction that is triggered when we have concluded that an action would be wrong. So the second reason the contractualist account is better is that it provides a higher order reason that shapes our practical reasoning. There are 3 features to this shape that Scanlon calls positive, negative, and dynamic. The positive feature of the shaping is like, when people refuse to license us to do something, their reasons for objecting to us need to be taken into account in our practical reasoning. The negative feature means that you recognize that some considerations may not be relevant in one context, but can be relevant in another. What is wrong in a context can be right in another. Like, for example, lying is wrong when it's to your partner, for example, but lying would be good if you are lying to a Nazi to save a Jew. So the dynamic feature states that there is no fixed practical reasoning when it comes to right and wrong, in the sense that there are no fixed lists of consideration that are morally wrong or right, or reasons that are always excluded or included. So we are constantly revising and rethinking right and wrong, since situations change, circumstances and people change, and so each new situation requires a different kind of practical reasoning. So our justifiability to others is an instant of recognizing that dynamic feature of our practical reasoning, which is of course needed for what we owe to each other. As he says, the aim of justifiability to others moves us to work out a system of justification that meets its demands, and this leads to a continuing process of revising and refining our conception of the reasons that are relevant and those that are morally excluded in certain contexts. So hence, we saw that contractualism offers an explanation for moral motivation that corresponds to what we normally experience in our daily life. It also accounts for the fact that we have different reasons for moral judgments and actions, and there is no fixed set of rules that determine what is the right thing to do in every case. Rather, it leaves it open for the people to provide their reasons. And so contractualism offers an account for why some values have more importance and priority over other values, and also solves the Pritchard dilemma. Although Scanlon has more to say on that in the next sections, to which we are going to turn now. So, in the case of importance, we say that when someone fails to be motivated by morality, we consider it a serious fault. being left cold, for example, by morality is something to be concerned with, because what is at stake is more than just, failing to see the force of reasons of some kind, of some other kind than moral ones. Contractualism can explain why moral values have more importance than others, and why people can fail to see this importance. In the case of amoralists, who understand the difference between right and wrong but fail to see or deny that there are reasons to care about such things, these are people who fail to be moved by morality because they are mistaken about their reasons. Then there are amoralists who have different tastes. Like, people can fail to be moved by morality, like someone who fails to be moved by the beauty of a painting because it is not his taste. This view is also mistaken, because this presupposes that to be moved by values, one has to enjoy those values. But as Scanlon says, the importance of moral values is not about enjoyment. But morality is not aimed at enjoyment, so the reasons to give it a place in our lives are not conditional in this way. So this failure doesn't, of course, mean that people are irrational, but that they are missing something. They are missing to see something that would make the importance of moral values obvious to them and would gain a more importance in their lives. So if someone doesn't see the value of science, for example, or of a historical monument or of a natural park, and he is okay if it is destroyed for the sake of the economy, for example, then these people are, in Scanlon's words, missing something in at least two senses. There is a category of reason, a form of value that they are failing to appreciate, and their lives are poorer because of this lack. So someone who is willing to throw all of the chemical wastes in the Grand Canyon misses the reason for appreciating the Grand Canyon, and as a result their lives would be less attractive for those who value the Grand Canyon. Like, I'd rather be poor and value the Grand Canyon than to be rich and dump all of the toxic chemicals in there. And so this sentence is important to understand the point that Scanlon is getting at with this section, because I think that failing to see the reasons of being moved means that someone's life is poorer than someone who acknowledges those reasons, and this leads me to adopt an attitude towards those people. How they value morality has an impact on the nature of my relationship with them. So the reasons, like, this person has to not acknowledge the value of the Grand Canyon is necessary for me, since I am in a contractual relation with this person. He owes me reasons as much as I owe him reasons too. And my relationship with him is determined by those reasons. If I have reasons to value chess or poetry or philosophy, but others fail to see that value, I can't really discuss these things with them or enjoy them or appreciate them with them, So these blind spots, as Scanlon says, affect our relation with those who don't share our enthusiasm about the things that we value. And so, sure, this is acceptable when it comes to things that can be confined to taste. Someone who doesn't share my taste in art can still be a good friend, can still be a good neighbor, can still be a good colleague. My best friend doesn't share my enthusiasm for philosophy, but still we are best friends. Things are, however, different when it comes to moral values. If my best friend is racist or sexist, if he's a homophobe, if he believes that the working class is immoral and must be exploited, it will certainly affect how I will react to him. This is because if he is unmoved by considerations of right and wrong, it means that he has an attitude towards me that is also problematic. Quote, "This failure makes a more fundamental difference because what is in question is not shared appreciation of some external value, but rather the person's attitude towards us, specifically a failure to see why the justifiability of his or her actions to us should be of any importance." So here Scanlon mentions another philosopher, Aurel Corneille. Now, he's a philosopher who distinguishes between instances where he is shocked that someone doesn't value his aesthetic preferences and instances of shock when it comes to differences in morality. The first are referred to as alienness, like you feel that the other person is alien to you, but that doesn't have any impact on your moral relationship to that person because the differences in taste are not a challenge for the relationship. But differences in what is right and wrong are definitely a challenge, and you know, I mean, they are conflictual and can conflict on concrete matters. Sure, sometimes they can overlap, like when it comes to not appreciating the same art as I do would lead you to want to destroy it, or to prevent people to practice the art that I value, for example. And not everything that involves moral values has to be challenging. If we both share the value that family comes first, but we disagree on what kind of family is better, if someone values the nuclear family while another person values large or polyamorous families, as long as no one demands the disappearance of the other type, these are preferences of alienness, and they are not challenges. But the idea is that when we are faced with differences in challenges and not alienness, the differences take a whole other dimension of importance. The differences in morality, for example, involve attitudes towards people, not just towards objects. So differences in morality are more likely to turn into challenges than just be, you know, alienness. You can think of the example of religion, for example. Scanlon mentioned this, writing, the gulf that some religious people feel separates them from unbelievers may be an extreme case of this. But even this feeling of distance has the personal character I have just mentioned only if the believer feels that denying his religion involves denying his standing as a person and that of others as well. So in other words, when a believer is faced with a non-believer, believers can see the divergence of appreciating the religion of the believer as either alienness or a challenge. In most cases, I think that believers would see it as a challenge because for them, denying the belief means denying morality altogether. And so believers may see non-believers as amoralists, and that can explain why they'd like to ostracize them. Likewise, non-believers can do the same towards believers. They think that believers are failing to appreciate this world or individual freedom, and so they're not being moved by moral judgments. And so when some denominations would mutilate the bodies of men or women, non-believers would say that's immoral and we're faced with a challenge. So in short, almost all of us have reason to see the gulf separating us from an amoralist as having this character, and that this accounts for the special importance we attach to seeing the force of moral considerations. So the conclusion from this section is that moral values have the importance they have because human beings derive their dignity from the fact that they are owed moral reasons. If your belief tells you that it's okay to treat me badly, or if you don't care that I'm being treated badly, so you think that you don't owe me any explanation for why you treat me that way or why it is acceptable for me to be treated that way. So if you consider that I don't deserve an explanation for why I am being treated a certain way, then to you I'm already an inferior being, someone who has no right for a life of dignity. And so therefore the importance of moral judgments and moral values lies in the fact that we owe to each other the reasons for why we hold such values as important. If you accept that you do owe me some some of those reasons, then you accept that we are equal and that I can prove you wrong, and therefore you cannot use any means to suppress me or reduce my freedom to object to your reasons. And hence the importance of moral value. They are basically the unit of what we owe to each other. Now, that tells us about the importance of moral values, but that doesn't say much about why they have the priority over other values, or why should they get the priority. Now, obviously, with what we said about importance, there was clearly reasons for priority, since moral values impact more my relationship with others than non-moral values, then they get some priority. But that would be taking their priority for granted. I mean, what really compels me to give them priority? Maybe I don't value my relationships with others that much. What if my non-moral values conflict with the moral ones? Like striving for excellence can sometimes be incompatible with the time that I have to spend with my friends or family, right? So there are cases that Scanlon argues are when one value involves giving certain considerations a status as reasons that other values rule out. So the value of excellence, for example, gives the consideration of spending most of my time working and practicing the status of a reason, but the value spending time with my family rules out that reason. So the example that Scanlon gives is more radical. It's from Bernard Williams again, and it is an example that kind of shows the limits of deontology and utilitarianism. Like, imagine a situation where you have to save only one person out of two. In that situation, if you are a deontologist or utilitarianist, the value of impartiality and duty, or impartiality of the greatest happiness, clashes with the value loyalty to my friend. So which one ought to take the priority over the other? Some may say that impartial morality doesn't have to be this impartial, like impartial morality that would make us have to choose between a stranger and a spouse isn't impartiality, since it doesn't take into account the morality of prioritizing your spouse or your friend, for example. In other words, principles could reasonably be rejected on the ground that they have left no room for valuing other things that are important in our lives. So if being impartial means that I have to devalue the things that I consider important in my life, then I have reasons to reject that impartiality. But if I consider the value of love or friendship to overrule the value of impartiality, then I have curtailed the demands of love or friendship by providing an argument to why, in this situation, I can prioritize them over impartiality. In other words, to prioritize love or friendship, I have to have another thought prior to it that justifies its priority in that situation. So the preference to save a friend or a spouse can't have unconditional priority either, and we need to see what gives its priority. So whether I'm contemplating loyalty to my friends or the impersonal morality, I have to ask the same question: why be moral? In the case of my friendship, even though it is not impersonal morality, I still have the question: why be moral to my friend? When clearly that loyalty can cost me some goods or other things that I value. So here too, we are faced with a Pritchard dilemma. Why be loyal to a friend? If we say because friendship requires it, we are taking it for granted, and if we appeal to another value than friendship itself, would be then thinking instrumentally and out of self-interest, so not a good friend. So again, the response is in between. It's in between these two extremes, duty on the one hand and self-interest on the other. What we need to do, according to Scanlon, is to characterize the relationship that friendship involves in a way that makes clear why it is something desirable and admirable in itself. If we make friendship desirable and admire it in itself, we then have reasons to engage in it. Friendship is worthwhile, and because it is worthwhile, it is worth sacrificing other goods over it. It is worthwhile because it brings about other benefits and things we value, like company or fun, and it is worthwhile because it is worth sacrificing things for loyalty to one's friend. So we kind of solve the dilemma by showing that it is not really a dilemma, that the two options are actually one single value. Being a good friend means that you enjoy the benefits of friendship and that you value loyalty to your friends, like you see loyalty in itself as a reason to bear a burden. In other words, friendship is about mutual recognition. It's not just that you do things out of duty or out of enjoyment. It needs to, it needs you to recognize your friend as a friend. So this is the same for other moral values. If we abstain from cheating or harming or lying to others, we don't just do it out of moral requirement because those things are wrong, like these aren't categorical imperatives or something. They are instances of positive value of living with others. And so this would explain why when we betray a friend, we feel guilty. Feeling guilty just because we didn't fulfill a duty doesn't really make sense if we didn't understand failing that duty as a negative impact on our relations with others. Like, feeling guilty is like losing that positive value you get from living with other people. But of course, in order to feel guilty, we also need to accept that others are entitled to that duty we violated, or that even though they're not, entitled to it, we can understand that they had good reasons to think that they were, or they could be. Like, maybe no one claimed entitlement to it, but you yourself, you can think that someone can ask for that entitlement. So, as Scanlon argues, the pain of guilt involves at base a feeling of estrangement, of having violated the requirements of a valuable relation with others. So understood, this familiar negative aspect of morality corresponds to a positive pull, the positive value of living with others on terms that they could not reasonably reject. So in other words, what we value in terms of morality allows us to feel like we belong with others. We are social creatures after all, and the positive value we get from life involves feeling like we have reasons to be there and accepted by others. And that's because we are living with them on terms that they cannot reasonably reject. It makes us feel safe and secure. We feel like we are at home. And so this, according to Scanlon, is a powerful source for motivation. To feel that you are living with others and that your ways of life is based on justifiable grounds, on reasons that others cannot reasonably reject, makes you feel safe, and therefore you are motivated to keep it that way. The reasons that you owe to others keep your community in which you feel at home. And so Scanlon gives proof of this by referring to the social and political changes that occurred in the United States during the 60s and the 70s. As he says, Americans during the 50s believed that their institutions were justified, that their country had no class barrier, no unfair discrimination, that merit is always giving to those who deserved it, etc. But the civil rights movements in the 60s and then the Vietnam War in the 70s destroyed those illusions. It turns out that the institutions were not justifiable at all. Racism and discrimination made it that now, well, people need to rethink their reasons, to rethink what they owed to each other, because what they thought were principles that no one could reject on reasonable ground turned out to be very rejectable and were badly affecting the nature of people's relationships to one another. So when we have racist policies that estrange people from each other, making it difficult for them to provide reasons that cannot be reasonably be rejected, the oppressor cannot do that since they are tied to their systematic privileges. And the oppressed can't neither, since the power structure is designed to make them unable to challenge the oppressor's reasons. So if the oppressed gives reasons for that the oppressor cannot reject, then it is game over for the oppressor. So it is necessary for the oppressor to make his or her voice heard over the oppressed. So such policies lead to a loss of meaningful things. The oppressed would feel obliged to participate in a way of life that they are rightfully reject, while the oppressor is participated in one that doesn't give him any merit, since it's all about his privileges. So the loss of morality also implies the loss of other goods. In Scanlon's words, it also involves the loss of other goods. One cannot take the same pleasure in one's cooperative relations with others as members of the same firm or university. Say if one comes to believe that they are being asked to participate on terms they could reasonably reject, and the meaning of one's own success and accomplishment is undermined, by the thought that they were attained on terms that they were basically unfair. So here, Scanlon is pointing at another way to look at morality. Morality isn't about constraints, as we often put it. It doesn't have to prevent us from enjoying the things we'd usually enjoy, like love, friendship, kinship, erotic relations, etc. Rather, morality is its prerequisite, since it is morality, in the sense of what we owe to each other, that is binding us together in order to enjoy those things. Quote again, when we look carefully at the sense of loss occasioned by charges of injustice and immorality, we see it as reflecting our awareness of the importance for us of being in unity with our fellow creatures. So this leads us back to the idea of priority. Why should priority be given to moral values? Well, because they underlie the other goods that we value in our lives. So now, even if this is true, it can be objected to with the claim that people can still prioritize their privileges over morality. Someone can be fine with losing many benefits that come with what we owe to each other if they can have one privilege. Like rich people tend to do that. They are willing to sacrifice morality altogether in order to stay rich. Other people, more modest maybe, would simply look the other way when we point to them the injustices that are resulting from their ways of life. They avert their eyes, as Scanlon says, or they wall off, meaning that they consciously try not to think about it. This is certainly common because a wholehearted acceptance of the injustices that our ways of life are producing is rare. Not everyone accepts wholeheartedly the charges of injustice and immorality. But we can ask ourselves why. Why is it so hard to accept those charges? Well, the only reason for someone to not wholeheartedly accept those charges is because they know that if those charges are true, they'll be losing the goods we mentioned, or they'll have to accept that those goods were not earned, since they depend on morality and now they discover that they were benefiting from an unjust and immoral system, then they're not entitled to those goods anymore. But once they wall off, it's too late. They have to do it with the knowledge that the system is causing some injustice. So they must know what it is like for those who are oppressed. Like there are people who don't enjoy the goods that they are enjoying. So they cannot feel feel guilt. If we agree that we owe reasons to each other, and you know someone is getting flipped over by your way of life, then there is reason you owe them that you are not giving, and this leads you to feeling guilt. So even if you wall off, then you'll do it with great unease that can only be over once they accepted the charges. But what if we're dealing with a hardcore amoralist, someone who can wall off with ease? Like such a person, Scanlon says, can enjoy things like friendship, but his relations won't be genuine friendships. Someone who can wall off with ease doesn't really see his friends as friends. So Scanlon says, imagine for example that you have a kidney failure and you need a new kidney. So the moral friend, because they see you as friend and are loyal and partial towards you, they do everything they can so that you get the kidney. This means that this may seem a good thing, but that means that he's capable of stealing a kidney. So suppose that happens. Suppose that your friend stole a kidney for you. This would be creepy, right? Like, what's creepy isn't that he just stole a kidney, but what does this act mean on his views of friendship? If he has no consideration over the person whose kidney they just stole, so the only reason why they don't steal your kidney is because they happen to like you, right? And also, this person has no respect for you as a friend, as someone who has their own moral standards. If you are a moral being, you know that you cannot steal someone else's kidney. Your friendship isn't just based on loyalty, but also on respecting your moral standards, especially when they are reasonable, right? Like, don't steal people's kidneys. That sounds like a pretty reasonable moral standard. By violating that, the amoralist proved that he has no limit to his behavior. They can control your life if they think it's for, you know, it's for my friend. You know, they can control your life if they think that that's what a friend would do. So what we are having here is the complete opposite of purely impartial morality. Here we have a purely partial one that is just inapplicable. And so such a moralist can't hold friendships or any other meaningful relationships, and they probably lose more than they gain. So let's just hope that people like that never gets to be in charge of other people's lives, except that, you know, we often know that they do. So what is important is that morality isn't either impartial or partial. Rather, morality is both. This is shown by the example of friendship here. A true friendship would be one that the friends mutually recognize the other's moral standing. Through that recognition, there is no clash between the values. When I need a kidney and my friend doesn't go and steal one, the impartial morality requirement, it's wrong to steal a kidney, doesn't jeopardize the relationship. On the contrary, it makes it more genuine. So to quote Scanlon, the conception of friendship that we understand and have reason to value involves recognizing the moral claims of friends ca persons. Hence the moral claims of non-friends as well. Then no sacrifice of friendship is involved when I refuse to violate the rights of strangers in order to help my friend. Compatibility with the demands of interpersonal morality is built into the value of friendship itself. Now, of course, Scanlon is aware that the degree to which we can have that compatibility depends on the kind of society we live in. If we live in a society in which it is normal to steal people's kidneys, being one of a few who has the moral standing of don't steal kidneys will become an obstacle to enjoying friendship. If you live in a racist or sexist society, saying that it is morally wrong to discriminate may put you in the minority, and by being put in the minority, well, you kind of become the amoralist here. So living in a society where we divide the world into us versus them would lead me to a choice between two incompatible views, the requirement of morality on the one hand and the warm feeling of belonging on the other. And so Scanlon doesn't really dive into this problem. He contends that he and people in his entourage probably don't have to make these choices, like liberal societies are predicated on not making people obliged to make such choices. But he knows that there are others who are faced with such choices. But the best thing to do in such cases is still to give priority to moral requirements. As for the situations with which he's most familiar with, the problem of priority then works in the same way for most values as it does for friendship. There is a three-stage strategy to solve this problem. The first stage consists in admitting that among the things that people value, there has to be reasons that would lead to the rejection of some principle, like having to choose between a stranger and my friend. I have reasons to value my friend that that can lead to the rejection of the impartial principle. So it is important for morality to include within itself a space for such reasons. The second stage is two parts, has two subparts. When you try to integrate the things that we value in morality, you're bound to meet some limits. Once you do, you argue for the reasons you give to give the priority to the values of right and wrong. Would the friend involve would the friendship involve that you go against your moral standing, that you of course accept and don't see any reason to doubt it? You then need to argue that your moral principles cannot be thrown away, that they are justifiable, and the goods you hold dear are dependent on them being safe from violation. Like, if my friend is the amoralist and is the one in need of kidney and he asks me to steal one from him, I'll be like, I can't be your friends anymore if you make me do that. Like, my friendship with you is sensitive to viewing stealing someone's kidney as wrong. And so it's the same thing with family or romantic relationships, or even when we are part of a community, or when we strive for some excellence. Take the example of science. Scanlon says, suppose you are a scientist who, for the progress of science, is willing to cheat, lie, or deceit, his colleagues and fellow researchers. You'd be someone who, in Scanlon's terms, like he says, this person would not only be violating moral requirements, but also failing to understand properly the value of his own enterprise. Science is a collective undertaken by a community of inquirers over time, and as such, it depends on truthfulness in reporting what one has done in one's experiments and what results were obtained. So failing to see value of the value of science also means that you fail to see what that value involves. So again, both the impartial or the impersonal and the interpersonal aspect of morality are not opposed, but they rely on each other. They are two sides of the same coin. They are both about what we owe to each other. So even when someone who goes along with a project that obviously violates the morality of science, or even someone who doesn't value nature, for example, is someone who has to provide reasons for why they think that that their project can dispense with providing reasons for others. So even if you want to give priority to non-moral values, you find yourself having to base that priority on moral values, on what we owe to each other. So clearly, moral values always have the priority. Now, some people can object to Scanlon's account of moral motivation that it is too demanding. Like, we can agree to it when it comes to friendship or in intimate relationship with spouses or relatives, but if we are going to apply this to every single one of our interactions, even with people we'll probably never see again, it can come off as extremely, tiring. Like, do I have to provide reasons for everything and to everyone? Sometimes I just want to live my life. I don't want to have to provide reasons for my, conservative parents to get a tattoo, for example. When you ask of people that they justify everything that matters to them, it comes off as unrealistically idealist. But on the other hand, Scanlon argues that it is equally weird to say that we don't have to provide reasons for other people beyond my intimate circle. This is like saying that as long as I don't meet as I don't meet people or don't have them in my intimate circle, I can litter all I want on the streets. I don't have friends that care about the environment, or I don't know of anyone who does, so I don't owe reasons to the people who value the environment. So fuck the environment, or I can pollute places that I will never visit. But here, someone can argue that in order to not to be a dick, we can just say that those things have value, and that just stops there. The morality simply lies in recognizing the values of those things or of other people or of other people's lives. Why do we need to justify? Why do we need justification in the sense that Scanlon is arguing for? And that is why we do need, in order to prove that something is right and wrong, to prove whether or not a system of rules of regulation would or not disallow that thing on grounds that cannot be rejected. Scanlon mentions the philosopher Judith Jarvis Thomson in a footnote here, who criticized Scanlon's point by saying, quote, "I cannot bring myself to believe that what makes it wrong to torture babies to death for fun, for example, is that doing this would be disallowed by any system of rules for the general regulation of behavior, which no one could reasonably reject as a basis for informed, unforced general agreement. My impression is that explanation goes in the opposite direction, that it is the patent wrongness of the conduct that explains why there would be general agreement to disallow it." But this is a misunderstanding of what Scanlon is arguing for. He's not saying that whenever you do something, you have to provide reasons for it to other people. Rather, his point is that our actions have to be justifiable. You don't have to actually convince others of that. Same thing with things that don't involve other people, like preserving some natural resources and not, dumping your waste in the river. To quote Scanlon, "What I am claiming to be central to moral motivation is not the activity of action, of actual justification to others, which does make sense only in relation to individuals with whom we are in contact and communication, but rather the ideal of acting in a way that is justifiable to them on grounds that they could not reasonably reject." But this can still not address the issue. People still can object by saying that here too justification is secondary and therefore not needed in many cases. What is primary would be things like the value of human lives, for example, or the value of the environment and the legitimacy of their moral claims. Being concerned with justification to others on those points is just a roundabout way of being responsive to those values and to valid moral claims. So justifiable actions don't mean that they amount to justifications to others. But to this objection, Scanlon says that we have to ask ourselves, what do we mean by things like the value of human life and valid moral claims? To say that something is of value, whether it is human life or a natural landscape or a painting, is to mean that we have reasons to protect it and appreciate it. By appreciate it, we mean that we need a certain attitude towards them that would make it clear that there is something valuable in those things. So the value of human life depends on our attitude towards it, so that when someone is killed, we do feel a sense of loss, whether we are family with the person or not. So I do not know, for example, any Palestinian who is killed by the colonial state of Israel, but when it happens, I get sad or concerned because we just lost another human life. Something we value, to something that is unjust, to something that we disvalue. But there is something different about the value of human life than the value of the Grand Canyon or a Picasso painting. And this is where the answer to the objection lies. Human beings have this capacity of providing reasons and justifications for the things they value, whereas a painting or a natural landscape doesn't. And this difference makes it that we don't value human beings in the same way as we value anything else. What's valuable in us is precisely this ability for providing reasons, which is also what would make us, value the valid claims, the valid moral claims of people. If I don't value human life in that way, then when my friend tells me don't steal the kidneys, I am not going to respect his moral claim. I can't really value, for example, the life of a Palestinian if I don't also respect his moral claims. Respecting means something different from agreeing with it, of course. It means respecting the capacity that he can provide justifications or reasons. It wouldn't make sense to say that I value your life, but not what makes you a human being, right? So the value of human life is indissociable from our ability to provide reasons, which is also indissociable from respecting our moral claims. So justifiable also means that even though we don't spend our time justifying ourselves to others, it doesn't mean that justifiability is secondary. So another objection is what Scanlon calls the problem of moral overload, which states that how can we possibly be asked to take into account the reasons that every human being, or even everyone affected by our action, would have for rejecting a principle? This is a recipe for moral gridlock, since every principle is one that someone has a reason to object to. So Kant, for example, has formulated a similar objection in a footnote in his groundwork for the metaphysics of morals. And it was an objection against the famous golden rule that don't do unto others what we would not want done to us. So for Kant, this kind of morality is too restrictive in the sense that it can be used as an objection to a lot of moral requirements. For example, a judge won't be able to punish a criminal because the judge would be doing to the criminal what he wouldn't want to be done to him. So here a moral requirement would neutralize morality altogether. The moral requirement of Scanlon to take into account the reasons that every man would have will lead to the same result. But Kant found a solution to the problem in his time and context. Instead of asking, what would I want if I were in another shoes, or even what would be advantage from each person's point of view, we should ask, what general principles of action could we all will? So this question would move from the gridlock raised by the particularities of each individual to a more general principle of actions. We are not going to refrain from moral action because of individual preferences. Sure, every moral claim can have an objection to it, but not all objections are relevant. We are not obliged to throw away everything, like the judge doesn't have to throw away the principle of punishing wrongdoers just because someone raised an objection. Just because the criminal has an objection doesn't mean that the judge must accept that objection. So judges often overrule objections, that's the point. And likewise, if we accept that punishment isn't moral and we should find other means to deal with wrongdoings, as in programs of restorative or transformative justice, we don't have to stop whenever someone raises an objection to transformative justice in favor of retributive justice. So the principle of justifiability to others doesn't lead to moral paralysis, and doesn't require that someone has to be aware of every single reason in order to speak up either. As Scanlon says, to avoid gridlock, we must move away from the idea that each person's life or each person's happiness matters to the question of an acceptable system of general principles of actions. Acceptable principles could not require us, in deciding what to do, to consider how every actual individual would feel about it. And in deciding which systems of principles are acceptable, we cannot envisage the reactions of every actual person. So instead, what you can do is consider representative cases only instead of individual ones. And the objections we accept don't necessarily dismiss the power of certain objections or don't recognize their force. How does this play out concretely? Well, that is what we are going to see in the next chapter about the structure of contractualism. For now, we can jump to the next section, the fragmentation of morals. In this section, Scanlon makes a distinction between what we mean by morality in philosophy and in the broader sense. Philosophically speaking, morality is often restricted to normative duties such as not killing, not harming, or not deceiving, as well as keeping promises. This is, of course, accounted for in Scanlon's contractualism, but some philosophers have deplored this narrowing of morality that is common in modern philosophy. Take, for example, James Griffith. He says that now moral philosophy is more restricted to questions like how to accommodate the interests of others instead of how should I live. And although Griffith doesn't condemn this change, others have. Like morality, philosophically speaking, was more about the ways we ought to live first as individuals. Like morality is supposed to show us a positive kind of life that we would want, and not just to live your life however you want, as long as you don't hurt others or something like that. This is something that Bernard Williams complained about, blaming philosophers to rely on the morality system, as he calls it, instead of focusing on ethics, which is more about how to live and should be focused on that should be the focus of moral philosophy. So there is a broader sense to morality. We're talking about things that, although don't deal with what we owe to each other, can still be used under the domain of morality. Take, for example, the sexual misconduct. Sexual misconduct can be directly recognized when they violate principle against coercion or inflicting harm on others, like for example rape, sexual blackmail, begetting kids irresponsibly, etc., are all wrong because they clearly violate what we owe to each other. But what about conduct like masturbation or sodomy when between consensual adults? These aren't about what we owe to each other, but some people would condemn them as immoral. This is not to say that they are, but that morality seems to have a broader sense than just what we owe to each other. For example, when it comes to friendship, failing to be concerned with the particular interest of our friends can be a dick move. We can say that the contractualist account takes into consideration such things, like you owe to your friends a concern with their interests. But friends don't want a concern out of duty, like we said, but rather a special kind of concern. That's not about what we owe to each other, not a special kind of obligation. You certainly wouldn't want your dad, for example, to care about your passion just because it is his job as a parent. A more direct analogy would be with work. When you work for someone, there is a contract between you two that addresses your sense of obligation towards each other. Your boss expects you to work for a certain amount of time, but even if you're not slacking on the job, you can be open to moral criticism when you don't show ambition beyond your working hours, or for maybe you had a talent that could be useful to the company that you are working for, but you didn't use it. Sure, you didn't violate anything in your contract, you didn't violate any principle mentioned, but you are certainly open to moral criticism nonetheless. Like, doing your duty isn't enough to make you immune to moral criticism. So surely you didn't harm anyone by cutting down a very old tree for fun, for example. Like, imagine you bought a property in which there is a 500-year-old oak tree there, and you decide to take it down. That certainly can be a dick move, even if nobody got hurt. So these examples for Scanlon show that the contractualist view I am presenting does not account either for the content or the motivational bias of all of them, of all that the term morality, as it is used by many, if not most people, is commonly taken to cover. Now, Scanlon thinks that there are three ways to respond to this divergence, this objection to the moral system. First, he says that He says, you can prove that the broader sense of morality is mistaken. So the things we mentioned that go beyond what we owe to each other, although we have to take them seriously, they are not about morality. That way, the things we have left would then fit in Scanlon's contractualism, and so this contractualism accounts to all moral requirements. Second, we can say that contractualism, as presented by Scanlon, is mistaken, and so we either drop it or we try to extend it in ways that would include the things we mentioned in the examples. And the third option, we just contend that, well, contractualism never claimed to account for all moral values, but simply to the ones that are about right and wrong, the ones that we owe to each other. This way we can say that it is true that contractualism doesn't account for the special concern or why you shouldn't cut down an old tree, but it doesn't does account perfectly better than other theories for what we owe to each other. So we would just leave those moral values that are not about what we owe to each other to another account that is fitting for them. This sure can seem like a fragmentation of morals or value, as some philosophers have pointed out, like Nigel and McIntyre. They argue that we live in an era where a unified theory of morals or values that can account for all instances of morality is no longer possible, and we should make peace with that. Like, McIntyre seems to be a little bit sad about it, but that's how things are now. But that's okay, because contractualism doesn't really have to account for all of those accounts, for all of those instances, because they are already presupposed, actually, in contractualism. Like, if you have a cool dad that does everything he has to do, but out of obligation, because he brought you into this world, and he has a responsibility towards you, and he has to take care of you because you'll die on your own. So this dad, although he's cool, may not have the motivation that a father should have. Like, a dad shouldn't be motivated simply by a sense of duty towards his children, although that's preferable to one that doesn't even find the motivation out of duty. But instead, there has to be a certain affect that comes with being a father that motivates you to take care of your kid. But as Scanlon says, this psychological affect isn't separate from the duties and obligation that a father has to do. He writes, affect is not a separable psychological element that might be added to the bare moral obligations I have described in order to produce an admirable parent. The lack of affect is a sign of the fact that the person I have described fails to see the good of being a parent, fails to see having children and caring for them as a way in which it is desirable to live. Without this evaluative element, mere affect would be meaningless. So in other words, when you do your duties and obligations, the affect is already presupposed. It is not, if it is not there, this is due to you failing to see the good of being a parent, that a life which you have kids, that the life in which you have kids is desirable. Such an affect is also a requirement to be to the good performance of those duties and obligations. A father who doesn't have that affect wouldn't really perform well in his duties and obligations towards his children. Just like a father who has the affect but feels burdened by his responsibility is also failing to see the good of being a parent too. So even if contractualism doesn't really account for the moral values that are not about what we owe to each other, they are still presupposed in it. They are requirements for contractualism to work. As he says, the values of friendship and parenthood are not independent of the narrower morality of what we owe to each other. So they actually shape each other. Like the value of friendship and parenthood shape the morality of what we owe to each other, and the morality of what we owe to each other shapes the value of friendship and parenthood. Like being a good parent or a good friend means valuing friendship or parenthood beyond what we simply owe to each other. But it is through what we owe to each other that we can value those things. Likewise, when someone fails to develop their talent or strive for excellence in work, we can say that although those are values that go beyond what we owe to each other, they're still dependent on it. The suggested form of criticism is that the person fails to grasp the value of achieving excellence or developing talents and is not sufficiently motivated by this value. Scanlon notes that these values often involve collaboration with others, and so they do have something to do with what we owe to each other. They are akin to the dual relation seen in friendship and family relations, connected to but not reducible to the core of general moral obligations. The same holds true for sex. Scanlon points that today sex morality has a bad reputation because it's often related to things we prohibit for no reason, like homosexuality is the prime example of this. Having sex with a member of the same sex was deemed immoral. Masturbation, sodomy, and other deviant acts were called immoral, and that brought a lot of needless sexual oppression and frustration. But although prohibiting those things is ridiculous and unnecessary, Scanlon argues that it would be a mistake to imply that there is no morality involved with our sexual practices, as long as those practices don't violate someone else's rights. He says that some sexual practices, like an emphasis on masturbation, can result in failure of seeing the value of sex and sexual pleasure, by giving it too much importance, for example, or by misconceiving what is desirable about it. Or when you fantasize about some people that would be horrified to know that you fantasize about them in the ways that you do. You can think of porn as an example here. People who look at porn a bit too much can fail to understand how sex is supposed to be valued. They can have a distorted version of sex, which can contribute to rape culture, for example, or to look at women in derogatory ways, or even at men, for that matter. Now, this doesn't mean that you cannot fantasize or watch controversial kind of porn, as long as it doesn't involve actual kids or animals or people who have not consented to this. But that an emphasis on it can lead someone to fail to appreciate the value of sex, of intimacy, of sensuality. Sex is first a practice you do with others, so it involves morality in the narrower sense. But like in the case of friendship and parenthood, that depends on morality in the broader sense, understanding what valuable in sex itself. So it's after all through that understanding, and not just out of a contractual sense of duty towards others, that rape is prohibited. As Scanlon says, in order to understand why rape is an especially serious wrong, worse than mugging, you need to understand the special reasons people have for valuing sexual intimacy and sexual relations, and for wanting to have control over them. Now, of course, Scanlon is talking about sexual practices that can lead us to misunderstand the value of sex. So if you thought of an objection to Scanlon's account that goes like how this would go with homosexuality, is it saying that homosexuals are failing to see the value of heterosexual sex and traditional marriage, or of living with a member of the opposite sex? Well, that's not what Scanlon is saying. Homosexuality doesn't make us misunderstand the value of sex, so chill. What you should be concerned with is, for example, the representation of sex and of bodies in the media, in advertisement, and in pop culture. And this doesn't mean that Scanlon is arguing for one right way to approach sex, but that there are many right ways to approach sex, and also many wrong ways to approach it as well. So we don't have to understand sex morality as the old-fashioned, uptight and oppressive conservative prohibition of everything that would show a thigh, or you know, classifying everything that is not missionary as deviant. Sex can still be a moral issue without losing all of the social progress we gained in terms of sexuality so far, in terms of sexual liberation. On the contrary, we can gain more progress by addressing moral issues within sex. If we don't, that's how the conservatives win. They're asking the wrong questions. That's true, but they are asking the questions in the right domain, the domain of morality. So the point that Scanlon is trying to make is that people care about our views on morality in the broader sense. Having judgments about what is moral beyond the narrow sense of what we owe to each other is essential to have a sense of community. So the point to the importance of shared values in various aspects of life, emphasizing the significance of, you know, being in agreement with those around us, the values related to friendship, excellence in a field, parenthood, sex, and other cases gain meaning through a community of individuals who understand and appreciate these shared ideals. And these extend to the broader concept of what we owe to each other. So we have to emphasize the role of hypothetical agreement in shaping moral argument, because, as he says, we have good reasons to want to live with others who share our notions of justifiability. And so this is something desirable. We have a desire for agreement in these moral matters, shaped not solely by the quest for justifiability, but also by a shared sense that certain things are inherently worthwhile. So we see that contractualism isn't a moral system, to use the term of Bernard Williams. It does bridge moral notions in both the narrow sense of what we owe to each other and the broader sense as well, by showing how those two depend on each other and the complex nature of their relation. You cannot have one without the other. Like, that's basically the point. So it is pointless to try to divide them, as in one category is the only one that deals with morality while the other doesn't. So the things that are considered moral in the broader sense, like sex, for example, lose their appeal and their value when they are excluded from the moral category. So not in the sense of they are excluded because they are immoral, but amoral, like they are neutral. So Scanlon says that their moral status is instead what gives them value, what makes them worthwhile. Scanlon will then try to illustrate this point even further in the next section about the scope of morality by answering the following question: how wide is the range of creatures whose treatment by us falls within the part of morality that contractualism describes? The point of that question is to highlight a poignant problem. If what makes us valuable as human beings is our capacity for providing reasons, does this mean that creatures who don't have the capacity aren't valuable, or morality doesn't apply to them? Do we owe anything to animals, for example, since they lack the evaluative capacity to formulate reasons? If we don't, does that mean that there is nothing that we can do to them that can be considered wrong? So we need to ask the question: what is the range of creatures to whom these duties are owed, and who thus can be wronged in the sense that I just then described? So this question is about the scope of morality, about the field or range of creatures that morality covers. This can be a problem for contractualism because it would exclude any entity that is unable to provide reasons. Contractualism, because it relies on the notion of contract between parties, can only be effective between people who can understand and agree to the requirements of the contract. So while Scanlon recognizes this limit to contractualism, he argues that the version of contractualism that he proposes doesn't need this requirement of reciprocity or mutual advantage in the capacity of, parties. He argues that what matters in contractualism is the binding relationship that I have with others. And others here mean more than human beings, okay? So that's the point of contractualism, is the binding relationship, not whether or not they can provide or understand my reasons. So Scanlon gives a list of requirements that are needed for something to be considered an entity to whom we owe reasons. First, those beings that have a good, that is, those for which things can go better or worse, to those beings in group 1 who are conscious and capable of feeling pain, those beings in group 2 who are capable of judging things as better or worse, and more generally capable of holding judgment-sensitive attitudes, those beings in group 3 who are capable of making the particular kind of judgments involved in moral reasoning, and finally those in group 4 with whom it is advantageous for us to enter in a system of mutual restraint and cooperation. So number 1 would be like plants, flowers, trees, and 2 that would be animals, and from 3 to 5 those would be human beings. These are the categories that fall within the scope of morality, meaning that these are the things that we want our actions to be justified to, or justifiable to. Now this justifiable to can be tricky. It may not be a problem for the categories starting from 3, because starting from 3 we have entered the realm of language. Like when you are capable of having value judgments, then you have to have a language. If you have a language, then you can have justification, and both parties can understand each other. And so, although in a footnote, Scanlon argues that these distinctions are not sharp, but are more like, you know, matters of degrees. Now, 3, 4, and 5 aren't exclusive to each other. It would be weird to say that someone who is in 3, so someone with language cannot also be in 4 and 5, because when you have language, then you certainly have the capacity for moral reasoning and enter a system of mutual restraint and cooperation. But rather, these categories depend on what individuals would consider sufficient for grounds on which they can't reject reasons. Some people can be convinced with our reasons for action simply on the grounds of our moral reasoning, and not on mutual restraint and cooperation. So this is a list of individuals we owe justification to. I may not be in mutual cooperation with you, but still I owe you reasons, either through moral reasoning or for the judgment-sensitive attitudes that I hold. So even if there are people who fall into one category but not another, like if there are people who have the capacity for judgment-sensitive attitudes but not moral reasoning, we still owe justification to them. This would be the case of an infant, for example. Children or adults that didn't develop their full cognitive abilities, for example, they may not fall into category 4, but still we consider that we owe justifications to our children, even if we feel that they won't get or understand our reasons. So the reasons for this may differ between kids and mentally disabled adults. In the case of children, it's a mistake to see them as separate kinds of creatures, but creatures that will eventually develop into 3, 5, or 3, 4, or 5. That alone is enough, a reason to consider that we owe justification to them. When they grow up, they can demand from us reasons for maybe the way that we treated them when they were little, and saying, you know, being a non-rational creature, I didn't owe you any reason, is pretty rejectable. So in the case of disabled people, even though they will never understand our reasons or justifications, we can say that we owe nothing to them. We still nothing in terms of reasons. We still do owe them reasons, just because they are disabled people. They are still human beings. So they are beings who are quote, born to us or to others to whom we are bound by the requirements of justifiability. This type of birth gives us good reasons to want to treat them as human despite their limited capacities. So we can clarify this problem by, you know, diving into the more problematic groups. Now, as I said, the tricky part is for 1 and 2. Now, does the fact that animals don't have language mean that we cannot have, don't have a human language, mean that we cannot be asked to justify our actions to them, and so including them in morality would be pointless? If I cannot justify myself to an animal, do I owe anything to that animal? Well, first, language isn't really the marker between 2 and 3. The marker is judgment-sensitive attitude. Like, an animal doesn't seem to have those. As we said, it's not really about language. We just see that it is hard to that is hard to be a being that has those but doesn't form any judgment-sensitive attitude. Okay, like, it's hard for a being not to have. It's very hard for a being to have language, but doesn't form judgment attitudes. But as Scanlon says, the fact that animals don't have those attitudes doesn't mean that we owe nothing to them. By the simple fact that animals, like any other creatures, want to avoid pain, we can say that they have a goal-oriented activity. Since animals have goals, no matter how limited those goals are, they become creatures to whom justification is owed. When we see an animal in pain, we often respond by wanting to alleviate the pain because we see that the animal has reasons to avoid the pain. You know, even if the animal is not having a judgment-sensitive attitude, you know, since a judgment requires language. The simple fact that you want to avoid pain means that you have reasons to avoid pain. So that fact alone is enough to say that it is morally wrong not to prevent animal pain when possible or to cause it without any justification. So torturing animals for fun or testing them for cosmetics is morally wrong, even though animals don't fall in the narrower categories as humans do. So 3 to 5 are categories of rational creatures, but we still owe justification to non-rational ones. And our justifications are moved by the same feeling we get whether we mistreat a person or an animal. When we mistreat an animal, we feel guilty to the animal, like we owe something to the animal, even though we know that the animal can't understand us. But we still feel like we have to justify ourselves, you know, to the animal. Now, this of course doesn't mean that you have to be speaking to your dog, hoping that you can provide reasons that he can't reasonably reject. Rather, here the justifiability is more owed to a trustee, if you want, a representative of the animal. As Scanlon says, we must take into account objections that could be raised by trustees representing creatures in this group who themselves lack the capacity to assess reasons. So trustees would act as to protect the creatures in group 2 when their good is being threatened by rejecting any principle that threatens that good on reasonable grounds. That something would cause distress to an animal is a sufficient reason for rejecting it, because we know that it would we know what it would feel like to that animal to be in pain. Since animals are just goal-oriented, but not necessarily rational like human beings, meaning that they don't have life projects. The only way to defend them on reasonable ground is just to raise the issue of experiential harms and pain. But since animal cannot make that argument, we can rely on trustees to do it for them. So we certainly do this when we are dealing with people that don't have their rational capacities fully functioning or developed. Disabled people, even though can't bring justification or can't understand our justification, can still rely on trustees to speak for them. So, and this is because just because the disabled person can't bring justification doesn't mean that they don't have reasons to live like any human being would want to live. Just like when someone who's ignorant of reasons to have a social welfare system doesn't mean that he doesn't have reasons for wanting to wanting a welfare system or doesn't need a welfare system. Quote, severely disabled humans have reason to want those things that any human has reason to want, insofar as these are things that they are capable of benefiting from. So they have reason to want people to take care of them, to allow them to live with dignity and security and affection. So these things are also desirable for animals too, even though an animal can neither give nor understand reasons for wanting those things: care, security, affection, etc. So this would also respond to the objections raised from speciesism. Speciesism is the discriminatory idea that some species have more worth than others, and based on that superior worth, they can oppress other species. Scanlon's account of contractualism isn't speciesist, since first, it doesn't exclude non-human animals from the scope of morality, and second, when we said that disabled people are included in that scope, just for the simple fact that of being a human born, that isn't a specious claim either, because it is it's supposed to say that since disabled people are also people, we would expect them to want the same goods as any other human being would want. So we would apply the same principle to non-human animals, to creatures that fall in group 2. We would want them to want what any other sentient being would want, and that is avoiding pain. So trustees can also make it possible for contractualism to account for creatures in the first category as well, like plants. We can apply the same principle to group 1, but it is not necessary, as Scanlon already argued, that we already have sufficient reasons not to harm creatures of group 1. The beauty, for example, the grandeur and the complexity of trees is reason enough not to harm them. But there is still one category that is worth mentioning. All the groups we listed seem to be about actual creatures, like creatures that exist in the here and now. But does morality stop just to people who exist, or does it also extend to those who don't exist? Like, what about creatures in the future, or what about those of the past? Like, do we owe anything to the dead, for example, or for those who are in the future, who are still not born yet? And the definitive answer is yes, we do, even though our duties to the dead and to future creatures are more limited than the ones to actual existing creatures. First, creatures who are dead or in the future are still creatures that exhibit, that exhibit some sort of want. They would want the goods that creatures of today have. Okay, like the creatures, what we would want today, creatures of tomorrow would probably want too. Like animals or plants, kids and disabled people, just because of their absence, they can't. Just because they cannot provide justification or can't reject or accept ours due to their being unable to understand them, isn't sufficient to claim, that we owe nothing to them. But so likewise, the dead and the people in the future, they cannot understand any of our reasons. But if we agree that even those who exist today don't understand our reasons while we still owe them reasons, well, we can apply the same thing with the dead or with people in the future. In the case of the dead, we think we owe them memorials, for example, or we owe them to visit their tombs, etc., because would be like we too want to be remembered. And as for the future, well, we obviously treat people in the future as people to whom we owe things. So, as Derek Parfit, another philosopher that we already mentioned, he noted, when we pollute the environment or when we waste resources, we are affecting those who are in the future. So our actions do affect people who are not physically here. And that alone is enough to argue that they are included in the scope of morality. In short, contractualism provides no reason for saying that people who do not now exist but will exist in the future have no moral claims on us. It seems then that contractualism draws us towards the second of the three alternatives I listed. The beings whom it is possible to wrong are those who do have or will actually exist. All right, so that's it. So then in the conclusion, Scanlon concludes by outlining the main objective of the chapter, which is to introduce the contractualist idea of justifiability as an explanation for the reasons shaping a crucial aspect of moral thinking. He discusses the implications of the contractualist account, suggesting it can explain the priority and special importance attributed to the described part of morality. However, contractualism doesn't encompass all aspects commonly associated with the term morality, and so this leads to the recognition that morality in a broad sense is motivationally diverse. And finally, he clarifies that the aim is not to prove that every rational person must be committed to this ethical framework, but rather it emphasizes their personal acceptance based on the phenomenological accuracy of contractualism in reflecting their moral motivations. So that's it. That's it for this video. Probably a little bit long, but it was a long chapter. But I didn't think that it was long enough to make several videos on it. The next chapter, however, will be the structure of contractualism. That's more dense, and so I will be making several videos. I think two should be enough to cover everything that is said in that chapter. So as always, thank you for watching.